This weekend, the 11th film in the Hellraiser franchise dropped on Hulu. So today we're going to stop and rank every Hellraiser film from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all 11 Hellraiser films, or at least as many of them as you have seen. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. As a point of reference, I hadn't seen any of the Hellraiser films from beginning to end until about 3 weeks ago when I finally decided to watch all of the original Hellraiser. Then a week back, I was at Fantastic Fest, and one of the surprise screenings was the new Hellraiser. We were the first audience in the world to see this movie, and that solidified it in my mind. I need to watch the rest of the Hellraiser films and do a ranking. So I've watched 10 Hellraiser films in the last 9 days, and I didn't actually even realize there were so many direct-to-video Hellraiser films. All I knew was they had a pretty bad reputation. Something like 3 or 4 of them have a 0 on Rotten Tomatoes, so I went in kind of expecting the absolute worst. I was actually pretty pleasantly surprised that even the awful ones had something to offer in the mix. With all that said, let's get started. In last place for me was Hellraiser Hellseeker. For me, this was the most offensive of the Hellraiser films for a pair of reasons. First off, it just completely feels like they took a generic spec script and just squished some pinhead into it to convert it into a Hellraiser film. It doesn't really tie into the mythology. There's just superficial connections and then Hellraiser showing up from time to time, so it just doesn't feel like it was in any way constructed to be a Hellraiser film. And then the second reason it's offensive to me is that they decided to bring back the original final girl from the franchise, Kirsty Cotton, and instead of telling a story about her, they kill her off in the opening sequence. Why would they do this? Use flashbacks of her throughout the whole story and then do kind of this Twilight Zone ending that does a twist to reveal what she was actually up to, but they used the character to make the movie seem like it ties into the mythology, when in fact, it's just some generic story with her name tacked onto it. You don't get anything satisfying out of this character. You just realize she married a deadbeat husband who treated her horribly, tried to kill her, and so then she made a deal with Pinhead to kill off him and 4 other souls in revenge for all the things they were trying to do to her. And that's just such an unsatisfying, gross use of the character in my mindset. And even at best, the movie feels just kind of like another just generic supernatural thriller. It kind of borrows a lot of the beats from Hellraiser Inferno, where there's this person that is investigating something, and as they're investigating it, they're slowly realizing they're kind of involved with it, and then the twist ending is that everything you've seen wasn't really what you thought it was. A plot twist that they used way too often in these direct-to-video sequels. So for me, it wasn't engaging, it wasn't memorable, but it was offensive in the fact that it's takes advantage of the Hellraiser name to get people to buy tickets to something and then misuses a character that deserved much, much better than what they did with her in this film. Coming in at number 10 is Hellraiser Deader, and for me, this is easily the most forgettable and least interesting of the Hellraiser films. It appears to be, once again, an example of them taking a spec script and then just converting it into a Hellraiser film.
As a matter of fact, it was.
Once again, we have someone investigating something and getting swept up into this world where they start having visions, but there's just nothing here that interests me. There wasn't a character that stood out. There wasn't a plot point that was interesting, and it's just another example of them using the Hellraiser brand to sell some spec script that was pretty generic from the get-go. There's a bunch of superficial ties back to the original run of films where someone's a descendant of the toy maker, but once again, it's just entirely superficial. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tie into the mythos in any meaningful fashion. So another movie that's very unsatisfying, that doesn't feel like a Hellraiser movie, and doesn't do anything to make a splash or make it stand out in your mind. Number 9, Hellraiser Revelation. Now, this is the one that I had heard the worst things about, and according to production history, they rushed through creating the film just so that they could keep the rights to Hellraiser, and they wrote it and shot it in literally a matter of weeks, and that absolutely shows when you watch the final product here. But one thing I did appreciate the film is that it actually seems like it's trying to use the Hellraiser mythology properly. It's doing the direct-to-video cheapy version of it, where you can't have all the creatures and stuff that you actually want, but the way that it kind of ties into the use of the box, someone gets torn up and killed, and there's a person bringing bodies to them to absorb their life, taking over skin. It's actually Hellraiser at its core with the story that it's telling. Now, it's the ultra low budget, cheapy version of it. It's the direct-to-video schlocky version of it. But the reason I put it above the bottom two on here is that it does have Hellraiser at its core and its mythology. And in that sense, they tried to do a Hellraiser film with absolutely no budget. Now, from there, we got quite a few problems here. The movie kicks off and it plays like a found footage movie about two dudes that just want to get laid. Like any of the gravitas of the first two films and maturity in the characters, that's all gone. It's just about two guys that want to get drunk and get girls. And that kind of plays out through the whole rest of the story. There's even a sequence where a girl makes out with who she thinks is her brother briefly. Like, there's weird stuff going on in this movie. There's a sequence where the villain is talking about banging a guy's daughter to the dad's face. Just weird, like, obsession with sexuality in a very weird sense. Obviously, these movies have always had a sexuality to them, but this is the really weird, immature version of it for, like, middle schoolers and horny college freshmen or something like that. The production budget's not the guy playing Pinhead gives a very, looks weird and gives an odd energy to the character. They actually did a fairly decent job of having this found footage element that creates a mystery in the story where you're wondering what happened, and then the character comes back. And the way that it ties into the mythology there actually was something that could have worked as a direct-to-video Hellraiser film, but not at $300,000, not shooting the movie in 3 weeks, not rushing through everything. The central idea was so much better than the execution, and the execution on this one, the budget that it was given, just absolutely shrinks it and turns it into the cheapy, crappy version of Hellraiser. Next up, Hellraiser Inferno, and this movie was actually directed by Scott Derrickson, who's gone on to become one of the top horror directors of the last 10 years and even directed a Marvel movie. And most importantly, he attended Fantastic Fest last week, where I saw the new Hellraiser, and he was just attending. He was just walking around. So there was a couple of different times I just looked over my shoulder and Scott Derrickson was just kind of standing there kind of playing on his phone or something like that. So that was pretty cool, and I got a little bit of footage of his shoulder on one occasion, kind of by accident. As for this movie itself, he insists that he wrote this as a Hellraiser film, but it feels an awful lot like they took a spec script about this cop thriller with some supernatural twist to it and then just shoehorned a little bit of Pinhead into it. Pretty well abandons the usual mythology, or it abandons the usual mythology entirely. The nature of the story doesn't match up with what's come before. It's kind of a different genre. It's a cop thriller investigating a series of murders. And so it's a very, very odd film to put in the Hellraiser franchise, and it appears to have created the template that the Weinsteins decided to copy for the next 3 or 4 films inside of this franchise. I think kind of on its own terms, it kind of works well enough as this Twilight Zone-esque film about this guy that's investigating these gruesome murders, and then the plot twist at the end, he's actually in his own version of hell, reliving everything, and everything that you saw before actually really happened. And it kind of works. This trick worked, I think, the first time the best for me. Maybe that's because Scott Derrickson, even in his first film, has a little bit more flair to it. There was just enough freshness to it, but worked well enough. There were several of these direct-to-video sequels that just used this exact formula. Investigate something, plot twist, nothing you saw was really real, shoehorn in a little bit of Pinhead into the mix. None of them are particularly great. None of them are particularly memorable. This one, being the first, maybe had the freshest take on that stuff. But also they like give them really unpleasant characters, and all of these ones that kind of follow this template where it's just like this awful person investigating other awful people, and then it turns out they're in their own hell. Okay, cool. Number 7, Hellraiser Judgment. This is another one that I went into just expecting the absolute worst. I'd only heard horrible things about the post-Bradley Pinhead films. And so I went into this one really not knowing what to expect. And not that I loved the movie or all that much, but I was actually pretty pleasantly surprised that it worked well enough on its own terms. It's essentially a reworking of the mythology with its own kind of set of rules, its own handling of what's going on with Pinhead, the Cenobites, and all of kind of those different elements. In which case, it's able to kind of tell its own thing without feeling like it's just rehashing what came before. It can break some mythology because it's creating its own mythology, and it's weird enough and interesting enough on its own terms. Now, it is another one of these direct-to-video films that is about this police investigation where there's a serial killer. What's going on with this person? Same plot twist as all the other ones. The person investigating was the person behind it all along, though at least this time the events actually did occur. And so it feels maybe too reminiscent of what was done in too many of those other films while doing a better version of it. And because it's doing its own mythology with things, it's able to do it in a way that it actually does intertwine the investigation with the Pinhead and everything going on in a much more compelling, interesting way. Now, it's not the most original film. It's not the greatest film. It has certainly many limitations due to its budget. By the time you've watched 10 of these movies in a week, it's like, okay, yeah, you got some fresh new things in here, but yeah, once again, investigation, once again, same twist. There's a lot of things that are a little bit too familiar, too much of what I'd seen too many times before. So nothing incredible, but actually quite a bit better than I was expecting, and a lot more interesting ideas that brought something new to the table. And it kind of found like new ways to creep you out and be weird, where there's like this guy that's eating pages that have been written on a typewriter, and then he's vomiting them in a tube, and it's spraying on like, ew. Just like weird, unsettling stuff in an all new way. And that's kind of what elevated this one for me, is there's actual new different stuff in here. A lot of same stuff, but a bunch of weird, creepy new things that actually made me go, ugh, besides just, skinning people alive. Though we do skin some people alive here too. Number 6, Hellraiser Hellworld. Now, to be perfectly clear, this is an abysmal Hellraiser film, but it's actually kind of a fun, generic, mid-zeros direct-to-video horror film with an unusually large amount of star power. So I don't know how to rank, where you are doing a Hellraiser ranking, so maybe I should have thrown it at the bottom because it's an abysmal Hellraiser film. But in terms of which one of these movies did I have fun with, which one will I remember afterwards, which one had ideas that was kind of like, oh, that kind of worked on its own terms, this one I felt was better than the ones below it. As a Hellraiser film, it treats Hellraiser as like a video game that isn't actually real, that kind of ties into it, but not really. It's another one that feels an awful lot like they converted a script about some people involved, played a video game too much, and then someone wanted to exact revenge after it, and they went, hey, what if Hellraiser was the video game? What if that's how we tied in the mythology? Like, as a Hellraiser film, it's just terrible. It doesn't actually use the mythology, doesn't use Pinhead correctly or anything like that. But once you get past all of that, it actually has a good bit of energy to it. The twists and turns kind of work, kind of. Throwing Lance Henriksen in as the villain of it elevates everything, as he's a great actor with an amazing screen presence. It just happens to have Henry Cavill, Superman himself, Geralt the Witcher, as one of the main cast members that's all throughout the entire film. So it's just, there's characters in there, actors in there that just elevate the material enough. And just, once again, when I'm thinking of which of these movies actually stood out to me that I was like, oh, that was kind of fun. I was kind of digging what they did with that movie. This one stood out. Too many of the ones below this are just these generic movies about investigations with awful people. Then it turns out none of it really happened all along. And this one has that too. This one does do the same twist of none of it really happened, but it does it in a different way of like the people are buried alive and there was something kind of going on there and there was some truth to it. So it just seemed like a mildly better, certainly more entertaining version of what a lot of these goofy direct-to-video Weinstein-produced movies where they converted spec scripts into Hellraiser movies. For me, it was the best of the batch of those, largely because of the cast and largely because it does just have a certain energy and vibe to it. Doesn't fit in the Hellraiser franchise, but it worked kind of on its own. In 5th place, Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth. And this one was a real odd mix of good ideas and bad execution. The central plot line of Pinhead himself trying to trick someone into bringing him bodies in order to consume their souls so he can regain his body on the earth and bring his carnage to the earth itself, not into this other realm. I totally dig that as a Hellraiser plotline. That's a good idea, and it's able to create some interesting new scenarios for the franchise with him walking through this urban setting, turning people in front of him into Cenobites, and then having them just wreak havoc on this community. Fresh, new, exciting, different, a little bit bigger in scope and size in a certain sense than what they were able to do with the first two films with the limited budgets that they had. Totally dig it. But the execution itself, the dialogue itself, the script itself, the ideas in their specific ways that they played out, not nearly as good. This one in particular felt like there were some performances and some lines of dialogue that just had no excuse being as bad as they were. But more importantly, there's just some stupid stuff in here. There's just no excuse for it. It's just too goofy, where Pinhead makes a Cenobite that has CDs sticking out of his head, and he shoots CDs at people.
You serious?
That's stupid. That's goofy. I don't think that would have fit in any of these goofy movies. Maybe Hellworld, because that one was just so silly and about a video game and stuff like that. But, I mean, it just doesn't match the tone of what's going on around it at all. And so there's just stuff like that that made you go, oh, what? Why would you do something like that in this movie? Another big standout one on here on this one for me was our lead actress, played by Dax from Deep Space Nine. So it was nice to see her. So this one was like in this really weird spot for me of like, yeah, I like the overall idea of it. I like the overall flow of it. It doesn't have kind of it doesn't have like the small, cheap size of the direct-to-video ones where they just couldn't do stuff. So like just in general, the payoff of the third act was fun enough for me to kind of put this one higher up on the list. And at the same time being like, man, like all you had to do was not write terrible lines of dialogue, hire real actors with a little bit of your budget, and not have a guy shoot CDs. That doesn't feel like gigantic big asks, but you really messed yourself up by the way you did some of this stuff. Number 4, Hellraiser 4 Bloodlines. Now, I went into this movie not knowing much about it, got to the end of the credits, and it said directed by Alan Smithy, which is the biggest red flag you can have when you're watching a movie and it says directed by Alan Smithy.
I got a bad feeling about this.
That means the director hated the movie that was put out so much that they had their name removed from it and they used Alan Smithy, and they actually had to retire that name because everyone figured out, uh-oh, this means the movie's going to be really bad. Then it cuts from Alan Smithy to Pinhead in space.
Not a great plan.
The other big gigantic red flag that you can have with your horror franchise is when it goes into space. But despite having the two biggest red flags imaginable, the movie actually kind of works. Once you buy into the fact that we're going to have Pinhead in space, then it starts telling the story about the origins of the box and how it's kind of tied into things over history, and then it ties into some elements that happened at the end of the third film. And I went, all right, I'm actually on board with this thing somehow. Somehow a movie directed by Alan Smithy that was like, the Weinsteins messed with it in post-production, and they actually went into space. And it's in 3 different timelines. they found a way to tell a story that's a prequel, or I guess it's two bookends for the entire franchise and a direct sequel to Hellraiser 3, and it was pretty coherent and consistent in the way that it did it, of telling this story of the toy maker that originally made it, that established a bunch of mythology that kind of tied into a bunch of the direct-to-video sequels, and then having this story of the building that was teased at the end of Hellraiser 3, introducing a new kind of main player in there in Angelique, and then bookending this whole mythology with how would you destroy the Cenobites, this box, this doorway, this gateway into hell. I don't know, it kind of worked for me. It's goofy by being in space, but it doesn't play it campy. It actually plays it pretty straightforward and serious. It's just like, let's jump forward in time, let's jump backwards in time, and complete the mythology. And I don't know. Compared to what a lot of the other ones did that weren't about the mythology, they were converted spec scripts, or did any number of other odd things, hey, I'll take it. Real quick, before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of the Hellraiser films. My list isn't the right list. It's just my list, and I'd love to see yours. And keep in mind, I'm brand new to this franchise. I'm just experiencing them for the first time, and I watched all of them in a very short period of time, and that probably changes the way you think about them. So if I rewatched them, some things would probably move around, but this is my first impressions of the Hellraiser franchise. Also, if you enjoy horror movies and horror rankings, I've ranked a ton of the top horror franchises: Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Scream, all the big ones, Conjuring. You can check those out right up here. And now in that playlist, I've finally talked about the Hellraiser movies. In third place, Hellraiser II, Hellbound. This movie is a mix of a little bit of a rehash of some plot points of the original film, and then doing this big, gigantic, ambitious expansion of the mythology. And this is an example where a movie does kind of rehash the plot points of the movie that came before, but does it kind of bigger and better. And so in the example of this one, you have the stepmom luring someone to bring her body back to life. But also in the mix, our new character that's doing the luring has his own actual desires, not for the woman, but for the power that comes with the box. And so he has his own evil motives leading up to this back half of the movie, where we just kind of go into this weird, wild hell world, have Cenobites everywhere all around us, and just building out all of the mythology on all the different levels. And in doing so, like, as I was watching it, I was really even kind of tempted to maybe put this one up on top of the list, because I was just like, all right, yeah, it's doing a bunch of stuff from the first one, but just doing it bigger, better, adding more rules to it, more characters, more plot points, and just this bigger environment for everything to take place. I am really tracking along with this, and it got to a moment where I was like, all right, this one's on top, and then it quickly made some choices that made it so it's only in third place. So essentially you get to a point in time where the lead character's done this investigation, learned about Pinhead, how he ties into all this, and that he used to be human. So you have this moment where they find a little way to humanize Pinhead just a little bit. Just not so much that there's not evil there and violence there, but just enough to there's something else there. And you have a moment where this other creature joins into our world, the doctor character, and Pinhead is going to battle this evil threat. And the Cenobites are going to do what Pinhead tells them to do and attack this other threat. And I was like, all right, all sorts of evil Cenobite monsters in hell duking it out. Yes! And then the way it plays out is that our new guy that I'm less interested in, because he just showed up 30 seconds ago, easily wipes out all these characters that were these big gigantic threats from the previous movie.
But why?
That's what knocked it back for me. The way that it played out, that they're just no threat for him at all, they're just taken out. I thought that was so odd, so unsatisfying. If you're going to do this plot point, if you're going to include it in the story that Pinhead has a change of heart, actually is like, wait a minute, re-engages with a little touch of humanity, and is going to battle some demon in hell, why would you have them just be killed without putting up any kind of fight? That was so strange to me, such a weird direction to kind of take things, and so anticlimactic that change that one plot point. Have this more interesting, more of a battle here, more of whatever. Maybe have some reason that our Doctor character is able to defeat them, but not without any sort of fight actually being put up by them. That's what knocked this one down to third place. Otherwise, really cool follow-up that just redid plot points but made them bigger and more interesting. Even like the little bit at the end where Kirsty uses the skin to her advantage to help someone and trick the monster at just the right moment. I was all on board on all that stuff. Just I wish Pinhead battling our Doctor with his Cenobite buddies had more weight. Our runner-up, Hellraiser 2022, the reboot or reimagining of the franchise. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I saw this movie at its actual world premiere. Groovy. And it was a surprise screening. We went into a theater not knowing what we were about to watch, and then it turned out to be the new Hellraiser film. And at the time I watched this movie, I had only seen the original Hellraiser the week prior, and I hadn't seen any of the other movies, so it was kind of like this fresh new viewing. And then I watched like 6, 7 of the Hellraiser sequels, and then I watched this one a second time. So I've watched it 2 times, going into discussing it here. And both, I think when I first watched it as well as rewatching, kind of solidified the fact that like this to me is one of the best of the franchise. And it feels like it pulls a bunch of the best elements of the Hellraiser movies and just repackages them in a way where it can establish its own rules, tell its own story. And what I really appreciated about it is that it established clear rules for how the puzzle box works and what people are trying to accomplish when they're messing with it and what the Cenobites and Pinhead are doing in their manipulation of people. Whereas even the original one, there's like Pinhead and Cenobites are kind of secondary to Frank the Monster. Here, they're central in what they're trying to do in manipulating these people with everything kind of going on. So Cenobites are front and center, especially in the back half of the film. And you understood what was going on. It wasn't kind of this murky, strange mythology. The movie, as our lead character's investigating what this box is, as she learns what's happening, we do too. And as she has a thought like, wait a minute, there's a resurrection configuration. Wait, I could bring my brother back. I could use this. You understand, you're thinking that at the same time as she's thinking that, and you understand where the story's going. And as you go through plot points and she learns, wait, there's deceptions in the mix, you come to the conclusion she's coming to because you're on the same journey as her. And then where characters don't learn their lesson and they think if they keep using the power, they'll finally get what they want. As an audience, you're like, oh, that guy's going to pay for that. And so I really appreciated the fact that they gave us a clean, concise mythology that you could understand, you could follow, and track along as you moved throughout the story. Along those same lines, while it's obviously 21st century production being put out by 20th Century Pictures and put out on Hulu, it's not like a CGI fest. There's all these practical effects, prosthetics, it's real things. And so it can still feel kind of throwback while still having modern aesthetics at the exact same time to it. I thought the characters kind of had more meat to them in a lot of ways. There's some twists and turns that I wasn't quite like. Some of them you could kind of tell where it was going, where the guy at the opening sequence and he disappears and you're like, you don't cast that actor. That's the biggest actor in your production, the most recognizable face. That guy's going to come back at some point in time. And when he does, it kind of, you understand what's kind of going on, why it's played out the way that it has. And all along the way, you just get just enough twist turns to make it really work. You get the nasty, gory horror, but it doesn't like just go to it immediately. It slowly kind of builds to it. There's always blood throughout the whole thing, but it takes its time to really start getting to the nasty stuff. So you kind of build up the shock value of everything taking place. So for me, it doesn't have the big impact of the first 2 films and just how shocking they were, how weird they were. It's a little bit mainstream in the way it's constructed and everything like that, but a really nice reimagining with a clear, concise mythology. But coming in first place is the original Hellraiser, and this is just such a fascinating horror film because it's not anything like you expect it to be. Pinhead is one of the 80s horror icons, but he's nothing like a Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, or Michael Myers. He's not this person hunting people down and killing them. He's part of this grander mythology. And in fact, the main villain of this film isn't so much Pinhead. He's there. He's part of the awful stuff that happens, but it's actually Frank the Monster. And so it's a movie I went into, and it just plays out so differently than the way these stories traditionally play out. And it unfolds its narrative and its secrets and its mysteries as it goes along, where you're even trying to piece together, what exactly is our story here? What exactly are we trying to accomplish here? And the character that we're following at first, that you think maybe is this woman is going to be one of our heroes, no, she's one of our villains, as well as one of our victims all along the way. Also, as a horror film, it's actually truly shocking with its gore and what it shows. Over the last couple months, I've been rewatching Friday the 13th and Halloween movies, and all throughout the special features and everything, they keep talking about all the cuts that they needed to make in order to obtain an R rating. And they're literally talking about like someone being stabbed, and like we could only show it for a second. And then you watch Hellraiser that came out in the exact same window of time, and there's like people being skinned alive. There's a character, Frank the Monster, who is just like this pile of flesh walking around, and it's actually disturbing, nasty stuff with flesh being ripped off people's bodies. And somehow during this window of time, the MPAA gave this an R rating and allowed it to be released. But yeah, just has this unnerving atmosphere vibe to it. You have a totally normal woman like giving into temptation and desire, and thus luring in men to be massacred and brutally killed. And just all this stuff that are unsettling ideas that add to the horror of it. It's not Pinhead doing most of this stuff. It's just some lady that is tempted by this man and will do horrifying things because of it. And that's where you kind of see the best of this franchise, when it's dealing with the actual temptations that people have, the actual desires that they have, and how nasty and gross those can take, where it can take people. And you just get that. And the thing that just truly makes this movie astonishing is that this was this very low budget, independent film that was so assured in its production, has such nasty images inside of it, and put its budget to good use in a sort of way that makes you go like, how did this movie turn out so good and look so good and be so nasty and gory, where all these movies with much bigger budgets and much better technology couldn't nearly come close to what this one was able to accomplish. So for me, easily the original comes in first place. It is a standout horror film that's unique, it's interesting, it does something different, but it's still horrifying, nasty, and scary. So it comes in at number 1. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, I've done a bunch of other horror rankings. You can check them out in that playlist right over there. The Scream movies, Conjuring movies, Insidious movies, Friday the 13th, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and many, many more. Evil Dead, all right over there in that playlist. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV.